This is the story of how a single summer destroyed Britain, the most powerful financial empire the world had ever seen. And it wasn't the summer you think. Most people who study British economic history point to April the 28th, 1925, the day Winston Churchill announced Britain's return to the gold standard as the moment everything went wrong. Keynes wrote a famous pamphlet about it. There was a general strike. It makes for a clean narrative, but that narrative is wrong. The real catastrophe happened 11 years earlier, in the final days of July 1914, when the financial architecture that had made Britain the centre of the world began to collapse in a matter of hours. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed before. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain wasn't just a great power, it was the great power. The British Empire was, in the words of historian Colin Cross, the only world power in terms of global influence. Britain accounted for 27% of the world's manufactured exports. Its trade to GDP ratio stood at 54%, dwarfing Germany's 40% and America's 10%. Net property income from abroad represented roughly 9% of GDP. A full third of British national wealth was held in private overseas investment. And sitting at the centre of this vast web of capital and commerce was the City of London, the undisputed financial capital of the world. As the banker Sir Felix Schuster remarked in 1912, with no apparent irony, "We are the centre of all things." He was right, and then came the summer of 1914. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. Within hours, global markets began to seize. London, the hub through which the world's financial transactions flowed, struggled enormously to cope with the international scramble for liquidity. Money that had moved freely across borders for decades suddenly froze. On Friday, July 31st, the Bank of England raised its rate from 3% to 8% in a single day. It was not enough. That same Friday, the London Stock Exchange closed its doors for the first time in its 117-year history, and it would not reopen for 5 months. Think about that. The most important financial exchange on the planet, the beating heart of global capitalism, simply shut down. And it wasn't alone. During August and early September of 1914, every stock exchange in the world closed, with the bizarre exceptions of New Zealand, Tokyo, and the Denver, Colorado Mining Exchange. More than 50 countries experienced bank runs and asset crashes. The financial crisis of 1914 triggered the sell-off of roughly $3 billion in foreign portfolio investments, primarily by British holders who needed funds for the war effort. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $96 billion today. And despite its unrivaled severity, this crisis is virtually unknown, overshadowed by the war itself, buried beneath the mud of Flanders and the poetry of Wilfred Owen. But financially, this was the moment the old world ended. The British government bought time by declaring an unprecedented 4-day bank holiday. During one frantic week, the Bank of England was buying bills at discount rates that climbed from 3% to 4%, then 8%, then 10%, the highest interest rates in the world. These were emergency measures for an emergency that would never truly end. Now consider the numbers. Before the war, Britain's national debt stood at £651 million, having been steadily whittled down since the Boer War. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, it had exploded to £7,171 million. That is an 11-fold increase in 4 years. Defence spending alone tells the story. In the fiscal year 1912 to 1913, Britain spent £72.5 million on defence, about 3% of GDP. By 1915 to 1916, that figure had reached £1.4 billion, 41% of GDP. The deficits peaked in 1917 to 1918, when total government spending of £2.7 billion was matched by just £700 million in tax revenue, and the fiscal deficit exceeded 40% of GDP in every year from 1915 to 1918. But the debt was only part of the damage. Britain lost 715,000 men killed, with more than twice that number wounded, representing the destruction of 3.6% of its human capital. It lost 10% of its domestic assets and 24% of its overseas assets. 40% of the British merchant fleet was sent to the bottom of the ocean by German U-boats, crippling the maritime infrastructure that had been the backbone of British commercial power for centuries. And then there was the money owed to America. Britain had borrowed $3.7 billion from the United States government to equip its troops and feed its people, much of it arranged through J.P. Morgan and Company, which served as Britain's principal financial agent in New York. The shift in the creditor-debtor relationship between these two nations was not a gradual evolution. It was a violent inversion, accomplished in 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Before the war, Britain lent money to the world. After the war, Britain owed money to America. The US Treasury still keeps a running tally, and the most recent public figure shows a total due of $16,669 million, a debt Britain defaulted on in 1934 and never fully repaid. Meanwhile, as Britain bled treasure and manpower into the Western Front, competitors moved into the vacuum. Japan and the United States replaced Britain in international markets during the war, building successful industries that undermined British first-mover advantages in cotton textiles, shipbuilding, and international lending. These weren't temporary gains. Britain suffered a permanent loss of world market share, losses it would never recover. This is the context that makes the 1925 gold standard decision comprehensible, though not forgivable. As early as 1918, the Cunliffe Committee had already recommended a return to the pre-war gold parity, enshrining that target as official policy before the ink on the armistice was even dry. When Churchill, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, finally announced the return in April 1925, he was implementing a plan that had been building for nearly a decade. Montague Norman, the Bank of England's enigmatic and deeply influential governor, had championed the return to gold throughout, convinced that restoring the old parity was the only path back to monetary credibility. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Strong, governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was Norman's closest counterpart in these negotiations, and their correspondence reveals just how intertwined Anglo-American monetary policy had become. But the world those men were trying to restore was gone. The pound had been trading at roughly $4.40 on the open market, and pegging it at $4.86 meant raising British export prices by approximately 10% overnight. British coal, British textiles, British steel, all of it suddenly became more expensive on world markets at precisely the moment when those industries were already struggling to compete. John Maynard Keynes savaged the decision in his pamphlet, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, writing that the plight of the coal miners is the first, but not, unless we are very lucky, the last of the economic consequences of Mr. Churchill. His biographer R.F. Harrod later noted that the pamphlet was composed in Keynes's finest controversial style, that every sentence told, the arguments were unanswerable, and the reviewers, mainly hostile, could only fume and splutter. Churchill himself dismissed the criticism, insisting the return to gold was no more responsible for the condition of affairs in the coal industry than is the Gulf Stream. He was wrong, but here's the crucial point. The gold standard decision didn't create Britain's decline. It accelerated a decline that was already well advanced. The patient was already critically ill. Churchill simply denied it medicine. The consequences cascaded. In May 1926, 1.7 million workers walked out in Britain's first general strike, lasting 9 days. Triggered directly by wage cuts in the coal industry, that the overvalued pound had made inevitable. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's government held firm, and the strike collapsed, but the underlying economic wounds it exposed did not heal. Britain limped along on the gold standard for another 5 years before being forced to abandon it permanently in 1931. And throughout the 1920s, in the background of all of this, the deepest recession Britain had ever experienced, running from 1920 to 1921, had already demonstrated just how fragile the post-war economy truly was. Recent scholarship continues to confirm this reading. In June 2025, the Bank of England itself hosted a centenary conference examining the 1925 decision, with scholars from multiple disciplines revisiting its historical context. The academic consensus has increasingly shifted toward recognizing that the structural damage of the war, not any single post-war policy decision, was the primary driver of British economic decline. The story of Britain's fall from economic supremacy is not the story of one bad decision by one chancellor on one April afternoon. It's the story of a civilization that entered a war as the world's unchallenged financial superpower and emerged 4 years later as a debtor nation, stripped of a quarter of its overseas assets, missing 40% of its merchant fleet, burdened with a national debt 11 times larger than before, and permanently displaced from markets it had dominated for a century. The decline didn't start in 1925. It started in 1914. Everything after that was just the long, painful process of a nation learning to live with what it had lost.